record. We are live and direct. All right, good evening. We'll let everyone else trickle in. We are in class 11. Wow, it's March 31st. So 2021 is a quarter of the way over. Things feel like it just started. All right. So let's get busy. We were talking about structural racism, institutional biases, microaggressions, right? And that is leading into a discussion of what we were supposed to be talking about if we were on schedule with the affirmative action and dividing a racial realism theory. That's what the schedule or the syllabus says. We're a little behind, but not really, because once we hit structural racism, that gives me, or I'm taking this as the opportunity to give you a framework. And Professor Bridges' book mentioned a discussion about frameworks and whether structural racism is more than a slogan, whether it can be actualized into a framework where basically all of racism and its structures can be identified and categorized and analyzed. So I have my own, which is racially asymmetric marketing imperfections and failures. And through that, I incorporate, or I try to demonstrate how that can incorporate implicit biases, racial microaggressions, affirmative action, all of the things that we are supposed to be discussing last week, this week, and the upcoming weeks. That is part of my attempt to, as Derek Bell says, divine a racial realism theory. Okay, so we are not very far off from where I'd like to be. So I'm kind of happy, to be perfectly honest, even though I know maybe it might be a little confusing that the syllabus says that we're going to talk about X today, and we might be a little behind. Okay, so as we normally do, let's talk. I'm sorry. So thank you to those that have reached out about the final projects and meetings. Again, I'm very impressed. I'm very enthused and anticipating some very good stuff. Again, the standard is just to teach me something, and each one of you that I've spoken to so far has selected a topic that will teach me, that I get to learn something. So I'm very excited about it. For those that have not reached out, plenty of time, and just hit me up. I've even scheduled at least one meeting. I believe I'm meeting with somebody on this weekend. I work on Saturdays and Sundays. It's not a problem. So whatever is convenient for you all, we can probably make it happen. So let me know if you haven't already. Okay, we only have two more people. Any comments, questions, concerns? Mm-hmm. Oh, no comments, questions, or concerns about the project. People have asked about page maximums and minimums. There are none. Thankfully, this is a critical race theory class. So as much as I appreciate formalism, it is a little more open-ended. And that the standard is, on the one hand, as far as I'm concerned, I want to be taught. So if it teaches me something, it has accomplished that goal. From your perspective, I would like to think, and this is my approach to professionalism. My approach to professionalism has nothing to do with my hair or whether I wear a tie or any of that. My approach to professionalism is you are a lawyer even before you pass the bar. So any project that you turn in is pretty much representative of what you would give a senior partner, a judge you clerk for, a client, etc. So from that perspective, it merely has to be something that you are proud of, right? The standard I was given in law school was always, would you hire a lawyer who prepared as you do? All right. Again, feel free to use the chat room or comments. I'm trying to get a little better at incorporating that more smoothly. Um, Current events. I'm gonna leave the big one till last. I do want to note that again, I believe it was yesterday there were oral arguments in the case of NCAA versus Alston. As a critical race theorist and a sports fan, again, that is very important to me. I cringe, or it concerns me that the rules of the NCAA in limiting the payment of athletes has not been seen as a critical race issue, even though it disproportionately affects income earner or potential income earners that are predominantly Black folks. There's two issues. One is before the Supreme Court, which is an antitrust issue. And I've mentioned before that it is a little disappointing to me that critical race theorists have not attached themselves to many antitrust issues. And this is one of them. And so the question becomes whether a group of universities can come together and create rules that limit people's pay. Now, it's a very discrete issue that they're dealing with, but California and the Ninth Circuit have already sided with the athletes. So it's really interesting on what the Supreme Court is going to do. I always try to analogize it to you as law students. Imagine if law firms, all the top law firms agreed that first-year lawyers, the maximum salary would be $75,000. On top of the fact that we're going to draft you instead of allowing you to choose your employer. So those type of restrictions are not allowed in the regular marketplace because of the antitrust rules. However, they have been allowed in the NCAA because of tradition. So the question becomes whether those traditions are going to stand. That's just the case. There's also the NCAA players that have adopted a hashtag saying not NCAA property, that outside of what they get compensated for with their scholarships, that they are not allowed to exploit their name, image, and likeness as they choose. Someone who is on academic scholarship can do tutoring and get paid for it, can do all types of things. Someone who's on a dance scholarship or a music scholarship can cut a record deal or an album, and the university does not have any rights to it. However, athletes, once they sign their scholarships, have given up their rights to their name, image, and likeness, and that may be a legal issue coming up. Any comments, questions, concerns? One of the foremost academic for anyone that happens to be interested on these issues is Michael McCann at University of New Hampshire, the Sports Law Institute there. So if you happen to be interested in any of those issues, please check out his blog or or even send him an email. Please, for all the projects, for all your research, please know this. We are in a very small fraternity. As academics, nobody reads our stuff. Please reach out to the people that you actually like, because they are dying for someone to say, hey, I actually read your stuff and am interested in it in any particular way. I almost guarantee you 95% of the time you're going to get a very enthusiastic response from scholars if you reach out to them. It's really interesting. Another issue. I'm sorry. Okay, I see some people getting feedback. Okay, let me try the microphone. Let me try the. Okay, is there feedback now? Is that any better?
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Oh, okay. Good.
Thank you.
Good. All right. I appreciate you guys pointing it out. Like I said, I'm getting a little better with going back and forth between the chat stuff. All right. Cool. Well, sorry to give the athlete short shrift, but here we go with the next current event. So President Biden has submitted a list of nominees for judicial appointments. While I and some others have been probably disappointed with certain aspects of the first 90 days or 100 days when it comes to issues such as minimum wage and other things. I would have to say that judicial appointments, if there were no other issues at all, in, no other issues at all, that would be my reason for voting in any election, in presidential elections. And that the diversity that was promised as far as the selection of judges is concerned seems to be fulfilled. Again, you all can have your own opinions on that. You can find a list of judges that President Biden has nominated and determined for yourself. Especially you'd really want to go back and look at some of the articles that describe the composition of judges that have been appointed over the last 4 years to really get a sense of the need for equity in that respect. I would mention one specifically because she seems to be a very on the hot track towards the Supreme Court, and that's Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. What makes me think that she's on the fast track? Well, she's not only been elevated from a U.S. District Court judge to a federal court judge, she's taken basically Merrick Garland, the current Attorney General, who was nominated by President Obama for the Supreme Court, or would have been nominated if had he ever gotten a vote that wasn't more or less filibustered. She has taken his position on the federal, the circuit court for the federal circuit, which is often called the Rocket Docket. It handles a great number of administrative law cases. And one of the interesting things about the Supreme Court that people don't really realize, and even lawyers don't really realize it, if you take the Supreme Court's full docket year to year, there will be some rights cases as far as human rights, civil rights, etc. However, the vast majority of Supreme Court cases are administrative law cases dealing with technicalities, dealing with federalism, separation of powers, etc. And so being placed on the federal, Circuit Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit is often a stepping stone towards the Supreme Court for that experience. Any questions, comments, concerns about judges, nominations, people that you were glad to see, people that you would like to see? I think one of the interesting things about Judge Jackson is that she has, unlike, let's say, Brett Kavanaugh and Elizabeth Kagan, Judge Jackson has spent most of her time in the Federal Sentencing Commission. She has not been an academic, and therefore we don't have a lot of writing to evaluate, which can be good or bad. A lot of Supreme Court justices are told, for example, Chief Justice Roberts wrote very little before being appointed as a judge, because some people advise folks to keep your nose clean, don't say anything that could ever be construed politically in either direction. That is one approach towards getting to the Supreme Court. On the other hand, there are other justices such as Breyer, such as Kagan, such as even Kavanaugh, that have written extensively on originalism and federalism and published in Harvard Law Journal and Yale Law Journal, and that becomes their particular imprimatur, I guess you could say. I guess one of the things that disappoints me a little bit is because I am a critical theorist, the idea that you are a formal logician is a little lost on me. And so I would prefer Supreme Court justices being nominated by the left who can attack formalism, that can, I see the Supreme Court and legal argument almost like hip hop, that Supreme Court justices are the illest MCs in the game. I am better than you because I say I'm better than you do. And so this sword fighting with the pen is what Supreme Court justices do. It's what made Scalia famous. The fact that he would take subtle jabs at his colleagues and wind them so tightly within his writing that it becomes very attractive. And so the fact that we don't, the fact that we have Judge Jackson's opinions is one thing. However, I would, if I were president, which I am not, I would prioritize those who are very, very, very strong and persuasive writers who have just demonstrated as much, more than so-called legal logicians. But that would just be me. We talked about the Byron Allen. Anybody, any comments, questions, concerns, anything? I just wanted to note, we talked about the Byron Allen case almost 2 months ago, and it's very interesting. He's still at it. I believe he took out a full-page ad in the Detroit Free Press last week to call out another business. I can't, not Comcast, but another business that he has to deal with, and called out their CEO for being racist. And it's very interesting because I go back as far as a television watcher to when Byron Allen was just a comedian on and host of shows way back in the 80s, and to see that he is this multimedia conglomerate and I guess you could say activist at the same time is really a bit surprising. I guess also this week, again, we have more and more instances of aggression and violence against Asian persons, not just in California, but also New York and around the rest of the country. And that's the ones we know of, because I think sometimes I personally get a little frustrated when sometimes the ethnicity of victims are not identified when there is in fact a pattern. Because again, law enforcement and those that control it often don't want to exaggerate or amplify the racial tension or the ethnic tension. But I would say this, I do think this is a very strong, good issue as far as critical race theory is concerned, is the term "Stop Asian Hate." It didn't sit well with me when I first heard it, and I've heard some people criticize it. Does anybody else have an issue with the term "Stop Asian Hate"? And I've heard a couple criticisms from a couple different directions. Okay. So number one, I've heard criticism on the one hand that it's just a misnomer. It's just bad English, right? That you're not, that this kind of trend, and somehow instead of stopping white supremacist hate, right, we're stopping Asian people from hating. It just doesn't stop Asian hate. If we were to say stop white hate or whatever, it just doesn't seem to accurately describe the issue. And also, again, is it detaching it? And this goes back to what we were talking about with race and religion, race and disability, race and gender, and all that. Is how much do we borrow the terminology between movements, between subordination? Because I would argue that, again, Stop Asian Hate detaches that experience from white supremacist violence against Black folks, against gay people, against others, right? So segmenting it as Asian hate instead of stopping white supremacist violence seems to, I don't know, is not, in my view, the most effective way to describe the situation. And where do these slogans come from anyway? Who gets to decide which slogan we're going to use and how much it gets popular? You know? So I am going to step back because I'm going to assume that some of you have been watching And the same question has been put forth as far as the so-called George Floyd trial, right? Some people are disappointed that it is the Derek Chauvin trial, right? George Chauvin is on trial, not George Floyd. Except if you watched it, it does seem to be that George Floyd is on trial, which occurs quite a lot in these types of situations. And before I let you guys have the floor, I also want to make note that just today, several officers were exonerated in St. Louis for the beating of an undercover Black police officer. So as far as putting the victim on trial, we have an instance where after a police shooting and demonstration in St. Louis, after police were exonerated from killing a young Black man in 2011, the protest occurred in 2017. Police at the protest shot rubber bullets and tear gas, chased the crowd down, caught some of the protesters, gave one a beat down, busted lip, jaw, couldn't eat solid food for weeks, several surgeries, only to discover that that person was an undercover cop. The undercover cop sued and has won, I believe, settled for $5 million with the city. However, and I do believe at least one officer that was involved in his beating has already pled to something lesser. But as far as the other defendants in that trial have been more or less exonerated from that. So I think that's a interesting, again, when we talk about putting up the right victims or the right, I mean, some people do know. I mean, does everyone know that Rosa Parks, as great as she was chosen? That there were several women who refused to give up their seats on Montgomery County buses prior to Rosa Parks. One was named Claudette Colvin. The other one escapes me. Claudette Colvin, people remember specifically because she was a teenager but was pregnant. And because teenage pregnancy was looked frowned upon, she could not be, they felt as though she could not be the object of the boycott. And instead, Rosa Parks, having already been a secretary with the NAACP, already been an activist and vetted for these purposes, right, would be the better symbolic victim and whatnot. Again, it's not anything to take away from the great Rosa Parks, but when it comes to the trying to get justice, there is strategy involved. There is strategy involved. All right, so let me shut up, please. Comments on the George Floyd, Derek Chauvin trial. Have you all been in tune with it? I personally find it very hard to watch. Mr. Schmeling, please.
So it's more of an observation, I think, about how in a lot of the more social justice minded spaces, at least that I'm in, there's this big movement to take away the names of the perpetrator of these kinds of hate crimes and mass shootings. And so that's why, like, I've been really following the George Floyd naming situation, and in addition to the trial, but just because, like, with wanting to stop giving glory, because that's why we have such a pandemic of white men shooting people, is because they want their glory in their manifesto. And so is that anything that's also coming into play? Is those thoughts of are we pendulum swinging the other way, even though we've talked about taking away the glory from these people who do this, but yet now we're saying, no, actually, this is not George Floyd's trial. He's not here, so he can't be on trial. So are we still struggling as a society about how to talk to these things? Is that part of what's at play right now?
I think so. I think it's a huge struggle. I remember, again, the church shooting in South Carolina. Do you shame Dylan Roof, or do you promote the names of the victims and allow their lives or what have you? So I absolutely believe what you're saying is a part of the conundrum, right? That they are looking to be martyrs and whatnot, and to have their name broadcast and to become famous in some way. And this goes all the way back to even something non-racial. I remember President Reagan's shooting and John Hinckley wanting to impress, I forgot what was it, Meryl Streep or an actress or something like that. But
Jodie
whatever.
Foster? Was it Jodie Foster?
Jodie Foster, exactly. But again, but the idea that he could make himself famous, that he could make himself notable, and whether we want to give that to the perpetrators and the offenders, maybe we should involve the victims and whatnot. On the other hand, there is so I think it is very controversial in a literal sense. Let's Whitlock, please. Oh,
Yes, I just sent you a message in the chat. Your mic is still like a little bit,
it's a little bit okay.
but I have a contribution to the topic as well.
Please.
Yeah, I was gonna actually, Tim said a little bit of what I was thinking. I think at least on social media, like Twitter, I think some of it is like shorthand. And then the reason why people are unconsciously, maybe in some cases, saying the George Floyd trial is because he's like a little bit more prominent in their minds, because, you know, he was who, you know, we were out there marching for. He's who we're trying to remember in all of this. But I can see the other side of it, and that it's important to not say it's his trial because he is not the one on trial. So I do think there's like a little bit of like unconscious labeling based on like who maybe is more important and who we should be remembering through this.
Yeah, I agree. I think both sides of the issues are very genuine. And that's one of the hardest things about dealing with race and racial issues is it's not always very cut and dry. Ms. Torres?
I was listening to a podcast the other day that actually discussed jury selection for the trial, and the prosecution makes really deliberate questions to find out more of the political leanings and how that would tie in. So one question that I thought was really interesting that the prosecution asked potential jurors was how they felt about COVID restrictions. They thought that that was really telling about their feelings towards police officers, towards racial minorities, etc. And I personally have never met someone who is antagonistic towards, you know, the COVID protection protocols who isn't like a problematic person. Like I just haven't met someone like that. So I thought that was a very effective way of kind of figuring out who you want on that jury and who you don't want on that jury. Yeah, and I'll send the podcast in the chat.
You don't know how much I love that comment, because one of the things that we talked about when we talked about structural racism and whatnot is neutrality, right? Is this idea of neutrality, but there's pretext behind it, where we can find a seemingly non-racial issue to cover for what really is a race issue. So I'm not discriminating against you because of race. I just don't like people in that neighborhood, and that neighborhood happens to be all black. There's a reggae singer named Atana that has a great song called Wrong Address, and it's really interesting because she lives in Jamaica where it's predominantly black people against black people. And again, she's being discriminated against because of her address. And in the United States, that's very much often a proxy for race, from zip codes to education, et cetera, et cetera. And when we deal with technological algorithms, especially from Google and social media to artificial intelligence and law enforcement, again, these seemingly neutral characteristics can be put together intentionally and unintentionally to be proxies for race. And that's something that's very much on the forefront of legal thinkers in the 21st century. Great point. Great point. Pretext. Whew, big stuff. Ms. Ramirez, did you have a comment?
Yeah, but I mean, it was more so to the comment before this last one in regards to like the George Floyd trial, and using that. I noticed that some of the witnesses are actually saying like George, which I think actually personalizes him and like creates like some level of humanity.
Yes.
And then they'll refer to like Chauvin as Chauvin, which I think is realize how much like just calling somebody by like their first name provides so much humanity. So I think that there is a balancing act that you have to do there with like, this is somebody who was murdered and lost their life, and this is who we're here to you know, try to get justice for. But also, you know, I heard that they're going to allow evidence about, you know, an arrest from like months before, which, you know, I'm not surprised by, but it's unfortunate. So there's just this balancing act of like, he's not on trial, but also we want to remember and know like who we're fighting, you know, who we're trying to receive justice for. But I noticed there were some witnesses that were doing that. And I don't know if they were coached by the prosecution, but I thought it was a good tactic to kind of create this humanity for this person.
Yeah, I honestly struggle with that because it's hard for me to turn the intellect off and turn my philosophizing and all that good stuff. Because when I watch stuff like that, as much as I appreciate, I'm a sports fan. I am a competition fan. So as much as I absolutely appreciate tactics and strategy, the reason why I'm a sports fan is because it's only a game. That those tactics and strategy only determine who wins and loses there and the bettors who chose to put their money up. When those same tactics and strategies determine guilt or innocence, and that may hinge upon one side being of a better quality than the other side, it's hard for me to watch sometimes. I mean, and maybe that's me being overly sensitive. It is me being overly sensitive because I know a lot of people can stomach it. But for me, that is a part of it that's just always makes me uncomfortable. And one of the reasons why, again, I am so proud of the people that do criminal law, particularly because you have to take it home with you every day. And I just know that regardless of whether it was the prosecution or the defense, I would not be able to take it home with me every day. But let me just say that I remember when I did start law school, I thought that if I had to do if someone held a gun to me and I had to do the criminal defense, then of course it would be on the defense side. And the older I've gotten, the more that it's the opposite. That the older I've gotten, the more I have understood the power of the prosecutor. And it's really interesting because Kamala Harris and all that took a lot of flack from Black folks about being a prosecutor and locking up in the prison industrial complex and her role in it. And my response to them was, I guess it was better when all the prosecutors were white. So I encourage folks nowadays a lot more than I used to, that if they're interested in criminal justice, that they may be able to do a lot more good if they can handle the prosecution side. That's just been my personal opinion shifting over the last.
There was actually a podcast on Kamala and I can't remember if it was NPR but there was a podcast episode about kind of her history as a prosecutor and how problematic it was. But one of kind of like the little anecdotes and stories that's told in that episode is about how she was the only one when they were starting to police based off of, okay, they could be gang related if they dress, you know, like Eazy, or like, you know, if they're listening to like rap or like urban music, right? She was like the only one to speak up in that meeting and say like, well, my cousins like wear like FUBU, or like, you know, I have family members who like, I listen to that. So because I listen to that in my car, are you going to arrest me like in the parking lot? Because I could be like related in some way. So I think that, you know, there's a balance of like, you put people in those positions to also put context. And so that's important as well.
Oh, I always have to remember that. That is always a check on me because I am very critical of the illusion of inclusion as far as inclusive efforts and diversity efforts failing for the most part to close the racial wealth gap. However, I always have to concede the point that you're making, that studies have shown very, very clearly that one minority person in the room changes the conversation, right? Whether that's one black person in the room, a woman in the room, or what have you. With that one in the room, things are not said on the one hand, and then things are said on the other when there is someone from a so-called protected class in the room. So I definitely agree that that's true and meaningful, especially in contexts such as juries, right? When you have a jury panel that's several people locked in a room for several days, deciding on people's guilt and innocence, to not have voices that can represent marginalized and others out there, is very, very problematic. Great stuff. More.
I just have a personal question. I mean, I guess just what your thoughts are if Chauvin isn't convicted, what the repercussions of that would be, because it kind of reminds me of like the OJ trial, right? And what that means is, I'm like, America's gonna burn.
Yeah, what do you mean Rodney King? Rodney King.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why I'm not tuned into the trial as tightly as others. I'm scared. I've seen it too often. Scared, jaded, pessimistic. Even again, the case that I've given today, as far as the undercover officer in St. Louis that was not given justice other than monetarily so. I'm not predicting. I guess I'm preparing. Even personally, like what is my reaction, especially after having seen it over and over and over and over again. And also, I am one who, again, I voted for Biden. I will vote for the Democratic candidate, but I'm not in love with them. And I also felt very strongly that the support for Black Lives Matter last year was part of Democratic get out the vote efforts. And so once the inauguration has happened, we have not seen that type of funding. They don't have the same type of profile. And so I am afraid. And I don't think that there is organization and interest convergence, basically, to support a large movement afterwards. Will there be random violence? Unfortunately, I'm afraid there will. Will it be sustained into a movement per se? That is something I'm not as confident about. And honestly, really frustrates me because again, the people that are going to bear the brunt of it, it's not like we riot in Beverly Hills. It's not like we riot in Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. So again, Hakeem's bookstore with Yvonne Blake, who I've worked with a long time, and her dad opened the shop up in the 1950s. She's already struggling because of COVID restrictions, and to have her place boarded up again for another couple of weeks because she can't sell books because of riots in the middle of West Philadelphia. Nobody wins. Nobody wins. There's a book, E. Franklin Frazier, called The Black Bourgeoisie. Who wins is people like myself, right? I win. I have college degrees. I speak fluently or whatever, and so chief diversity officer positions will be available for me to placate the rest of the crowd and whatnot. That's the type of thing that I'm afraid of as a so-called racial realist. And to tie that into, there was a question in the chat room that one of these talked about progressive prosecution. And my pessimism, I'm sorry, from that question bleeds over to recently this week, Larry Krasner. The district attorney, the district attorney for Philadelphia, the self-proclaimed progressive prosecutor that has probably done more progressive things in the city of Philadelphia as far as criminal justice than any of his predecessors combined over the last 20 years. Again, he is not doing what I would do because I'm radical, but as far as someone within the system doing as much as they possibly can to affect, he has done that and has and his congratulations for it is that he has not been renominated by the Democratic Party in Philadelphia. Right? So as well as he's done, as good as he's done, his own party has rejected him in Philadelphia. So I support the idea of progressive prosecution. However, I do not ignore the fact that Kamala Harris, Joe Biden were found acceptable by the mainstream because of their roles as former prosecutors, because of their role in the 1990s incarceration movement, tough on crime movement. That's what made them acceptable to mainstream and corporate society, that Kamala Harris is not just dedicated to her blackness or her gender, that she is one of the, so it's progressive prosecution is something I'm in favor of. However, it's a tough sell because, again, when you deal with people that are in the inner cities, even amongst us black folks, right? If you're in the inner cities, people that are being let off on gun charges or what have you that end up back in your neighborhood and that happen to commit another crime because of economic deprivation that affects you, it's not a salve to that person that lives on 13th and Thompson to hear that, well, the offender only did it because minimum wage isn't high enough. The offender did it because the public school system isn't good enough. We know that that's true. We know that that's a fact, but it doesn't necessarily help the people that also live in the inner city along with people that are committing crime. So it's a very tough situation. I'm very disappointed in the Democratic Party of Philadelphia with respect to Barry Krasner, but I cannot say that I am surprised. Ms. Henson. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to follow up about, I feel like Harris is a little bit different than Krasner because I think the impacts of her kind of her time had such so there's basically a case where the Supreme Court compelled the state of California to deal with the overcrowding in prisons because it was in a violation of the 8th Amendment. And what happened after that is they did not comply with that order to kind of start releasing lower level nonviolent offenders, and also I think it was by giving people credit for time served, and credit for time served, yes. And so one of the arguments that her office made in kind of the follow-up was that who's going to fight all the fires in California if we start releasing lower level offenders? And the state of California, I mean, it's a massive prison population. So it's not just kind of like the local city prosecution. It's, thousands of people that, just like Joe Biden, that she, impacted and kept in prison.
Well, I don't think there's any question that if you're comparing the progressive bona fides of prosecutors, that Larry Krasner is definitely going to be much further, considerably further on the left than Kamala Harris. And again, I think that's also, again, her record there is what made her more or less, quote unquote, acceptable to the quote unquote powers that be. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that on the one hand, we want inclusion. However, to be included into the old boys club means being acceptable to the old boys. That's a conundrum of diversity. It's how push, get yourself in the door. I was just, as a matter of fact, right before, again, as a sports fan, I was watching a segment on ESPN about women sports reporters, right? And the trials and travails that many of them have had to go through to reach the place where they are. And it was interesting, again, how many of them felt that they had to not be themselves. Right. Some of the comments were, again, to not dress a certain way, to present themselves as genderless and whatnot. Again, to assume the role that people expect of you versus who you truly want to be. And I'm not saying Kamala Harris truly wants to be a progressive. I don't know her that well, although we were at Howard around the same time. I know some of the similar people, but I cannot claim at all because, again, I have frat brothers and brothers that are very conservative, that have grown up in privileged lifestyle, that have been robbed or have dealt with so-called black crime and have a very different perspective on these issues than I may have. So I think you're absolutely accurate that they are not necessarily in the same boat. I had an argument with one of those Thanksgiving arguments at the Thanksgiving dinner table and whatnot with one of my cousins years ago about how much I love Barack Obama. I think he is a great person. He is. I am so glad that my kids didn't know anything but a black president for most of their childhood, just as a symbol. But he's neoliberal, and I don't necessarily have a problem with neoliberalism. But for people to complain, to argue that he is progressive or expect him to be progressive, I just felt as though that was inaccurate and somewhat unreasonable. On the other hand, that we have to accept that people aren't monoliths and we have to, take them as they are, so to speak. And when I say take them as they are, I personally mean analyze them as they are and then strategize around what they are not. But that's just me. Great stuff. More, please, anyone, more. All right. Well, that's a great lead in to today. We're again trying to let's review where we've been. We've talked about political and jurisprudential ideologies, and that's recently come up again with this appointment of federal judges. So if anybody has any questions or comments or concerns about formalism, intentionalism, textualism, purposivism, dynamism, all that those isms and schisms we talk about with writing judicial opinions. Critiques of critical race theory, big tech critical race theory, intersectionality. We discussed legal constructions of race, Derek Bell's rules of racial standing. Questions or comments on these things, anything relate to current events we're talking about. White privilege, intersection of race and class. I guess with white privilege, when we talk about the privilege of being a white police officer versus a black police officer, really highlighted in that St. Louis case. Intersection of race and class, race and sexuality, religion, disability, competing or complementary discourses, right? Any discussion of that, comments or concerns? I'm saying, okay, so my audio off again? How are we doing? Are we okay? Ms. Carroll, you have a comment?
Oh, yes. I do also still hear a little bit of something off with your audio. But today in employment discrimination, we had a case and our professor was arguing that the question was whether race is bias. Like you brought up the difference between being a white police officer and being a black police officer. And the class discussion was about whether like black police officers would be biased toward black, perpetrators or whatever you properly call someone that has been stopped. And because the case said that someone wearing a hijab, that's a representation of bias. Like, white people would automatically assume bias because of a woman wearing a hijab. And it's so wild to think that it's literally a hijab, like, come on, that's bias. When what is, like, to me, a white person's skin color is enough bias for me to feel like if I got stopped by the police, I need to press record immediately. So it's interesting to hear, you know, how you just briefed over that. And literally in our employment discrimination class, it was 45 minutes going back and forth. And not to put you on blast, but Ms. Henson did have some really good points this morning.
Good stuff. And I remember, again, I grew up in West Philadelphia. My mother, both my parents worked for the school district. So we lived in a nice place in West Philly called Winfield. My mother had a red Volvo way back in the early 1980s. Little Volvo 245, not the long one, but the short one. And so when I turned 16 and got my driver's license, of course, the cool thing to do is pick up the squad, drive around West Philly, and look for a dollar house party in her red Volvo. We got stopped every single week. Couldn't have been more than 3 weeks go by without being stopped. And yes, I have to say, the black cops were worse than the white cops, right? Several years later, probably the worst experience I ever had with Philadelphia police, and actually arrested and to the roundhouse, and a cop in my ear talking about what he's going to do with this, that, and the other. Black cop. Go all the way to F the Police by NWA, written in 1989, and even in the lyrics there, black police showing out for the white cop, right? So it's not, so this idea of trying to perform, being in those circles and trying to outperform white men. Clarence Thomas, right? Many people argue again that he has tried so hard to be included that he's now at the point where he outdoes them, right? And that is his security in being in his social circle, in his particular circle. So it is certainly a very, very, very interesting dynamic when it comes to others, and I feel better about calling them out after Derek Bell called them out in his book. But again, when you talk about the Candace Owens and other people that believe in Black people's own inferiority. Again, I think I mentioned it last week. Chris Rock had a joke. Again, this is known within the community for years. Chris Rock had a joke in the 90s. Who's more racist, white people or black people? And his answer was black people, because black people hate white people and black people too. It was a joke, but the point being, there's so many examples. My mother, I remember she said in the South, there was a slogan that said, black people think white people's ice is colder. That if you have two stores right next to each other selling ice or water or whatever, even black people will tend to go to the white store believing that it is of higher quality when it is really just the same because of the influences. Oh my goodness. What's his man's name? Genius, 1930s. Albert Einstein said as much. Albert, please, if somebody can look up Albert Einstein on race. He has a quote. Albert Einstein was friends with the Black actor and scholar, and athlete and lawyer, Paul Robeson. If you don't know Paul Robeson, he's one of the baddest men on the planet. And he and Albert Einstein were friends out in Princeton and Rutgers and what have you. Then W.E.B. Du Bois was running NAACP's Crisis magazine and asked Albert Einstein to write an op-ed about American racism. And Albert Einstein in that article, in that op-ed says, the worst part about racism is not just the social degradation of the race, but it is also the more pernicious aspect is that the objects of racism adopt the view of the majority and tend to come to see people like themselves also as inferior, right? And so when that happens, again, if we go back to Stephen Garcia's theory, we talk about the rules of racial standing. Black people that see other Black people as inferior will get higher racial standing and higher accolades from white institutions than those that don't, and that reaffirms them because again, they become successful, and their success becomes through their own bootstraps, and you all that aren't successful are just complaining and fighting for civil rights. So in that intra-Black dynamic is very, 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 very prevalent. Dissension? Sure.
I was just going to say, I read this article a while back about Clarence Thomas and how part of his identity as a judge is based on what happened to him when he went to Yale, which he has like a pretty, I guess, negative view of his time there. And part of it was that all of his white classmates didn't believe that he had made it there on his merits. And he came from a pretty rural area in the South. His family, I think they were Gullah, and he worked to like lose his accent and do all these things. And once he got to Yale, people still didn't think that he deserved it. They thought that he had gotten special treatment because he was Black.
Well,
yeah, it's just an interesting kind of perspective, like reading back on some of the justices' lives, and also about like Scalia, and like trying to understand how they came to have, the attitudes and the perspectives that they have is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I don't think Clarence Thomas in that vein to me is very representative of a lot of Black conservatives, right? That see themselves as individuals, and that the representation of who Black people are, that they have either been taught or come to believe that they are above it and can't get the respect that they deserve because of the rest of us. Because we are dragging them down, because they can speak proper English, they have done hardworking, ingenuitive, and all that other stuff, and that it's these other folks that are dragging down the race. And so it's not extraordinary for Clarence Thomas and others to, again, feel that it's their job to prove their worthiness, and that the assumption by others that they are inferior because of affirmative action, but because of welfare or because of whatnot, causes them to reject those things because it doesn't give them their individual promise. Now, I've also read other things. I think people are very dynamic. That may be the reason why he has gone the way he has gone. I think there are other parts of his life that also influence that. From my understanding, Clarence Thomas also was somewhat radical, also considered himself something of a Black nationalist at one point. However, one of the reasons why I call myself racial realist, and I do not consider myself an Afro-pessimist, is because I believe Afro-pessimism naturally leads to capitulation. And if you capitulate, right, if you say you can't win, right, what's the whole slogan? If you can't beat them, join them, right? And so to those that believe that racism is permanent, that it will never get better, that it will always, then what's the point of fighting it? And instead, tuck in your lips, put on your skin bleacher, and speak as much proper Queen's English as possible. And the worst part about it is that those activities, as silly as I may think they are, and as much as I may say it in a derisive way, will usually lead to financial reward. The people that do that tend to do better financially than those who hang on to their quote unquote culture. So it's a very interesting gameplay. I mean, I love my dreadlocks. I love them without, but I also felt it was mandatory that I keep them. When I worked at the tax court, when I taught, that I needed to be known as the dreadlock tax professor as my one-man assault on that stereotype or what have you. So it is very interesting how any of us deal with the racism that we've dealt with, that we've already dealt with, and that which we expect to receive in the future. So great comment, great comments. More, anyone else? More. All right. So this class, so now we're finally already at 9 o'clock. How do I get that thing up? Well, someone's gonna have to let me know because I don't have my clock around me. As a matter of fact, if you hold on 1 second. Oh, and the question was, there was a question whether I was condoning respectability politics. I don't think so. I think my dreadlocks and all that is the opposite of respectability politics. What have you. I recognize respectability politics, right? Recognizing it to me is not necessarily the same as condoning it, just like as far as racial realism. The fact that we know that realism is not going anywhere does not necessarily mean one way or the other that we fight it or we don't fight it. All right, so last week we talked about structural racism. I just want to briefly go through Professor Bridges's description of it. First of all, she talked about the difference between structural or institutional or systemic racism. The argument that structural racism may refer to inter-institutional racism, where institutional racism is that racism that happens within one university or one organization. The idea about systemic or structural racism as unjust enrichment. Does structural racism make all white people guilty of racism? Isn't that the case for reparations, that all the entire society has to pay because the entire society is more or less guilty as accept the benefits of the fruits of slavery, Jim Crow, etc. And does, again, going back to this discussion of Black conservatives, does that cause white people and Clarence Thomas to reject it, to ignore it? And even more difficult for a lot of Black folks is to look inward. Are Black people who support the system racist? If the system is racist, are Black people who support the system racist? Can any Black person in this system avoid supporting it? And I find that interesting because I also grew up with, has anybody heard of the MOVE organization? MOVE, MOVE? Anybody heard of the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia, where the city of Philadelphia bombed a house, killing men, women, and children? Back to Africa organization named MOVE. The reason I bring them up is because even more than the Black Panthers or anything, MOVE was an organization that basically removed itself from the system, did not bought houses and then detached them from the grid. So no electricity, no water, no gas from the city. Did not put their kids into public schools or whatnot. As far of a detachment as the system that anybody has ever done within the bounds of the city. Now, they were attacked. They were eventually bombed out, and Mumia Abu-Jamal, who you may have heard of, is also a supporter of MOVE. They still exist, but they have been basically minimized. But the point reason I bring them up is because it is an example of Black people who have totally absented themselves from the system, such that those of us who remain, is that not a choice? Right? W.E.B. Du Bois repatriated to Africa. Stevie Wonder recently said that he is moving to Ghana out of the United States because he can't take it anymore. Right? So are those of us who remain in the system also racist because we support this system knowing what it is? So the elements of structural racism, again, according to Dr. Bridges, lack of intentionality, and that begs the question: does structural racism let white people off the hook? One can see read Eduardo Bonilla Silva's "Racism Without Racists." Another element of structural racism is its banality. Banality meaning smallness, microaggressions, the fact that it's a series of smaller interventions into race rather than large and public symbolic aspects, such as like lynchings and things of that nature. Race neutrality, that systemic racism and structural racism tends to always present itself as neutral. And that's why I thank Ms. Torres about her discussion of pretext, about how things that don't sound like they're about race can in fact be about race. And then lack of evil actors. And I think some of these blend together. And that asks the question again, where have all the races gone? We have an older population than we've ever had. We have more elderly people than we've ever had. And they hold more wealth than they ever had. However, that forces a lot of Black people to deal with the fact that people with a lot of power, 60, 70, 80-year-old millionaires and billionaires, come from an era where they grew up with segregation, Jim Crow, etc. And although they know they can't speak on it now, use their money in pretextual ways to uphold a system that preserves subordination. And then we also have to ask, even if we're talking about systemic racism or structural racism, do systems, institutions, and structures, do they create themselves? So I do argue that the hyper focus on structural racism tends to paint the United States as a product of its past, that it's just locked into what it used to be and it's hard to get out of it, and denies that there are in fact people with power right now using pretext to continue subordination. Voter suppression is not a product of systemic racism. Voter suppression is not a product of structural racism. It is a product of neoconservative movements to suppress votes. So hyper-focusing on structural racism, hyper-focusing against neoliberalism for one aspect, to me is, and I have to say hyper-focus. I'm not saying don't focus, but hyper-focus, what I mean by that is to focus on that to the exclusion of neoconservative and other forces that intentionally purport create racist dynamics. When we talk about intentionality, again, 95% of critical race scholarship is trying to get around that legal requirement of intent. That legal requirement of intent does emanate from Washington v. Davis. It also holds that statistics alone do not prove racism, which again opens the door up for efficient statistical discrimination. If for whatever reason, if Black people excluded from mathematics and high-level math classes, then a rule that says you must have high-level math to qualify for a particular position will discriminate by itself against Black people. And Richard Epstein and Richard Barnes say there's nothing wrong with that. That is what statistical discrimination is, and it is efficient. However, law is not necessarily meant to make the world efficient. And a murder could be efficient. However, it is still immoral and illegal for that reason, and no argument about its efficiency sways a court to say it's not murder. Examples Professor Bridges uses in the book about examples of structural racism, not in my backyard, the intersection of class and race, right? The idea that methadone centers, medical marijuana, waste treatment plants, new jails, and all that type of stuff tend to end up in Black neighborhoods, in the neighborhoods of the subordinated, right? Because they do not have the financial or the political capital to fight them. right? And that even with amongst poor people, poor white people, there is at least some, even an inkling of solidarity, such that if there is a choice between the poor white neighborhood and the poor black neighborhood, it will still tend to be in the poor black neighborhood. One of the interesting things, again, if you know me, I can criticize anybody. So you want me to give Abraham Lincoln a jab? Why did Abraham Lincoln not arm the slaves so that they could revolt for themselves? Slaves in Cuba, Spain told the slave owners of Cuba, if you ever rebel against the crown, we will arm Cuban slaves against you for your own massacre. They were expressly threatened with that by the Spanish crown. So the idea of arming slaves to facilitate their own insurrection was a known dynamic at the time. Abraham Lincoln chose not to go that route, and many argued that for him to do so would have been race treachery, right? So again, this idea that all of us have these biases, that all of us tend to favor those within our group outside of the people outside of our group, is a part of not just structural racism, but then we get to implicit biases that lead to microaggressions and lead to greater racial wealth gap. Now, here we're talking about what? Environmental racism. In Chester, Pennsylvania, and Flint, Gary, Newark, all around the country. Oh my goodness, there's in Louisiana, there's a growing body of scholarship on environmental racism all around the country, from toxins of highways to waste treatment plants to toxic environmental. And then we can also talk about Native Americans and pipelines and whatnot. So public school funding. All of these are instances where the link between them is there's no one person to point at and say that this person is racist, that the dynamics subordinate, that Black people and the people of color get the short end of the stick, and yet there's no one person typically to point the fingers at. Now, in Flint, Michigan, with that water crisis, there does seem to be at least one or two people that seem like they may have to pay the price. But again, most times bad actions are attributed to the system. So that begs the question: if wealth inequality is at the heart of structural racism, does addressing class issues fix racial issues? And you will hear this from a great number of scholars, especially in the tax field. When we write about race and taxes, the response we get from white tax scholars almost invariably is, well, if we just make the tax code better for poor people, then that will make the tax code better for Black people. The answer is it will make it better. However, focusing on it will not necessarily eliminate racism. How many people have heard the term racial capitalism? Those heard the term racial capitalism? A few people? I see some nods. Okay, so racial capitalism on the one hand is how capitalism makes money off of racism. Slavery is one of the original aspects of racial capitalism. There's lots, the NCAA, some people could argue, is another example of racial capitalism. The prison industrial complex, to some people's mind, is an idea of racial capitalism. How businesses and whatnot can make money off of race and racial division. However, less discussed in popular discourse is also Herrenvolk socialism, right? That there are social institutions created to promote fairness and collectiveness, and that have also discriminated on the basis of race. So I mentioned last week Darcy Brown in her book, The Whiteness of Wealth. She is also, she is not progressive. She is more or less neoliberal. And one of the reasons is because her view of history, and that she can present to you very stridently, is that every attempt to help poor people, the more government acts the worse the racial wealth gap ends up being. While we may speak out of our mouths and want to be fair and equitable, we have to be realistic about the government that we actually have and the people that actually implement those policies. They are not perfect. They are the people that we see on TV every day, and she does not trust them to make racial dynamics better. That is an argument, a conservative Black argument for government minimalism or government skepticism. We can go from there to Ira Katz Nelson when affirmative action was white. How many government programs there have been over the last 200 years of programs that were specifically dedicated to lift white folks out of poverty and leave others behind, people of color, Native Americans, Asians, Black folks, Hispanics, Latinos behind. We can talk about Social Security in the New Deal, excluding domestic and agricultural workers, which accounted for over 90% of Black people at the time, labor laws that discriminated against Black people, the GI Bill, Federal Housing Authority, even up to today's farm aid, which never considered welfare and never minimized or attacked, that is offered and doled out to 98 to 99% white recipients. So on the one hand, there is racial capitalism. There is also Herrenvolk socialism as structural racism. Slogans. The Dr. Bridges asked us whether we can move beyond slogans on the frameworks. Just wanted to point out some people before I give you my framework that also have worked on this idea of creating comprehensive frameworks. We mentioned Eduardo Bonilla Silva, although he does not work in legal law schools. He works in sociology departments. I think he's at Duke right now, and he is, I think, the president of the American Sociology Association or something. Ian Henry Lopez is a legal scholar. He has done some good work on the framework. The best ones I've seen, and I'm biased because I'm into economics. So of course, when I look at frameworks and whatnot, those that have an economic bent are the ones that I favor. And so Daria Roismeyer, reproducing racism, blocking segregation, racial cartels. She has developed very strong frameworks on how racism reproduces itself economically, in part because she has experience dealing with not just United States racism, but she also has studied South African racism and has studied how a minority population can dominate and subordinate a majority Black population in that country. There's my own racial asymmetric market failures and imperfections, which I am going to beat you in the head with right about now. Framework, minimum wage, absolutely. So we'll talk about that in a second. So implicit bias, racial microaggressions. I'm going to show you how they fit within the framework that I'm offering. That is a specific question about minimum wage, and we can talk about that as far as this framework as well. Where they fit within this framework that I'm calling racially asymmetric market imperfections. Now, let's start with the road to how I get there about racially asymmetric market imperfections. How many times you got? 30 minutes? I think we can do this. Also. All right, so first I'm going to talk about the racial wealth gap. In order to get to where I'm going, number one, you have to appreciate the racial wealth gap. Number two, you have to appreciate that the American ethos, generally speaking, especially the American so-called liberal ethos, praises equal opportunity over equal outcomes. You may have heard that phrase a lot when it comes to equal protection and what have you. Merit from equal that want of equal opportunity leads to a want for a society that is meritocratic, a meritocracy. And that meritocracy in our country is thought to be delivered best by a free market, right? Free market ideology. So those are three things that we have to kind of accept and comprehend before we get to racially asymmetric market failures and imperfections. That form derives from these other forms. So if we accept that, then I'm going to try to give you a little economics without mathematics. Right? We're not going to have any numbers in this. No graphs. We don't need numbers to understand economics. Right? And as a matter of fact, when I go through all this, I'll show you why the numbers are unreliable. But economics is not bullshit all to itself. It has tendencies, it has truths to it that do not require mathematics. So we'll try to hit that. However, once I give you those assumptions, that economic framework, we'll talk about what assumptions undergird it. What are we talking about when we talk about the free market infrastructure? And is the free market infrastructure perfect? No, it's not. And economists and legal actors admit it. So there are lots of legal responses to free market failures and imperfections. So just fraud, lies are free market imperfections that laws, right? If you think about freedom of speech, if meant absolutely, means you could not have laws against fraud, right? We do realize this, right? That freedom of speech meant perfectly means you could not have a law against fraud, right? And yet we do have laws against fraud. We do have laws against yelling fire in a crowded building, etc. So I mention that as because we have legal responses to these free market failures and these imperfections, and then we will show how structural racism can be described as those free market failures asymmetrically presented or asymmetric with respect to race. So that's the roadmap that we're going to go through in the next 30 minutes. All right, so let's start with the racial wealth gap. As we just talked about with Dr. Bridges' book, when we talk about environmental racism and NIMBY and public school and all that, that system is very close to saying that's the racial wealth gap, right? That those dynamics would not occur if there was no racial wealth gap. If Black people had the same wealth as white people, then there would be less environmental waste in those neighborhoods, etc. The numbers show that, and again, wealth is the metric, not income, right? The media will deceive you by talking about Black people and white people as similarly situated based on income. That is false. Similar situations are between people of the same wealth, right? Black people, and here's why. Black people of the same income. Black people and white people with less than, let's say, $30,000. White people still tend to have 4 times more wealth than the similarly situated or the similar income Black person. In other words, their home equity, right? Do they have a home? Does it have equity? Do you have a 401k? Do you have cars or other assets? And even for those that make less than $35,000 or somewhere around those lines, white people tend to have 4 times more in savings than the same situated Black person. Middle income, and it rises to 7 times more. Higher income, 11 times more, right? And these are just individual to individual. Now let's add that to your whole family, where you have a family of 5 or 6 and cousins, etc., where if you are Black or a person of color, and again, we could use Latino and Latina, and I believe the numbers are somewhat in the middle. So with Latina, it would be it's something like a third, a fifth, and 1/8. So doing a little bit better than Black folks, but the disparity between them and white folks is very stark as well. And so again, there's that difference between individuals. There's also that difference between families. And then if we take your social circles and put them together, you have one, you have totally, some people say 2 different Americas, right? The racial wealth gap we can tie directly to its beginnings to slavery and Jim Crow was 100% tax on black labor all the way up until 1941. Even though slavery was outlawed by the 13th Amendment, it was never prosecuted until the 1940s. So if something is not prosecuted, then it still continues. Sharecropping, convict leasing, the financial remuneration from those activities was no different than slavery. You just didn't get beat as often. So that transfer of wealth occurs for over 200 years. And yes, taxes redistributed from slave owners to general society. Taxes also redistributed from slave owners all the way up to the north. We can talk about that at another time. We also, if some people may be familiar with last year's book of the century, Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. It had nothing to do with race. Its only point was that in the 20th century, for that whole 100 years, it is very obvious that the gains from capital far outpaced and exceeded the gains from labor. And therefore, old money got richer and new money did not, or those that relied on labor just fell further behind. And that, again, unavoidable racial subordination without reparations that gets worse basically by interest rates. We can look beyond money. We're talking about financial capital here. There's also so-called human capital. Financial capital leads to all these other capitals, right? Human capital, my education, what I know, what I can do. Social capital, my connections and the institutions around me to which I belong. Political capital, my vote, my ability to organize and influence the scene. There are also gaps there, and Professor Bridges talks about that in page 152 of their book. Also want to mention again, Sandy Darity and Darrick Hamilton's The Political Economy of the Racial Wealth Gap, that if we look at wealth strictly, so if we take black people and white people of the same wealth, if we take Asian people and black people of the same wealth, if we take Hispanic people, white people, black people, Asian people, Muslim people of all the same wealth, do you know what we find? We all start businesses basically at the same rate. We all favor education at basically the same rate. We invest in our 401ks at the same rate. We invest in home ownership at the same rate. So when you see differences that black people don't invest in homes as much as white people do, the metric they will be using is income, not wealth. A black person with $50,000 of income is not going to buy a house as readily as a white person with $50,000 in income, because you do not have the family intergenerational resources for that down payment. If there is that wealth, there is that purchase. So defeating this myth of black inferiority, that black people need to be trained up to do better with money, that need financial literacy classes. Darity and Hamilton argue very persuasively that no, we don't need more financial literacy, you just need more capital. Okay, the liberal case so that's the racial wealth gap. Step 2, the liberal case against affirmative action and reparations, the things that would be most obvious to fix that racial wealth gap. So it's not neoconservatives that lead the charge. They are against affirmative action and reparations, obviously. But neoliberal or the liberal intelligentsia is against largely as well, based on the philosopher John Rawls's theory of justice as fairness. That justice has a lot of different meanings, religious, non-religious, or whatnot. But what John Rawls thinks that we can all agree with is that equal opportunity is something that a society should strive for, not necessarily equal outcomes. Okay. Now, I can criticize that and say that, again, if people are truly equal, that for there to be unequal outcomes means some people are just being set up for failure. You can make that argument, but John Rawls and our society right now seems to be locked on this idea that it's our job to give out opportunities, not necessarily guarantee outcomes. It is the progressive ideology, right? Progressives are those that most challenge the idea that everyone should have a very similar outcome. So this idea of equal outcomes relates to this idea of meritocracy, that you should rise if you are good, you should fall if you are not good, right? And good, what does good mean? I don't know, right? But hard work, thrift, intelligence, whatever, right? That's one of the problems with meritocracy. What constitutes merit? There's a great Netflix series out of Brazil called 3%. And I know someone was racist or white supremacist that adopted that 3% name or whatever. But the Netflix series is awesome about a society that tries to reconfigure itself on merit, and yet things just go wildly wrong there too. Great stuff. And so when we talk about merit, right, there's a very we can envision two different systems, right? A capitalist system or a free market system versus, let's say, a communistic system where the government decides, or something in the middle, which is what we actually have in this country, right? Should the government determine how much everyone gets paid, and how would they do that? And does the theory work in reality, given what social media has revealed about people, right? Our governors, the people we interact with. Do we trust? Can the government? We know that we can all agree that teachers should probably get paid more than professional athletes, and yet, even if we agree with that, how do we change that other than by government deciding how much everybody gets paid? And if that's the case, do we trust that as lawyers? As a lawyer, do I want to submit my income or wealth to whatever the government decides it is? And when we say the government, we're talking about Mitch McConnell. We're talking about Nancy Pelosi. We're talking about, and I want to name controversial, non-controversial, left, right side, because again, I just don't think that if you change systems, you change the people that run it. There's an argument that in any political system, people that rise to the top of that political system are just, they'll do that in anywhere they go. Does a free market represent meritocracy? Note that the West did not invent this idea of a free market. Again, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance of Europe is off the backs of what used to be thought of as a racial meritocracy. As far as the Islamic civilization was a very market trading-based civilization that stretched all the way from Asia to Africa to Northern Europe for over 1,000 years. Over 1,000 years. And its attraction to most people was the idea that so long as you were Muslim, it didn't matter whether you were Asian, African, European, or whatever the case may be. So this idea of the land of opportunity being the wealthiest civilization in the world right now rests with the United States of America, or maybe, and that may be contestable, but it does not start with the United States of America. That was Islamic caliphate's role before then, and Rome before then. So maybe say Egypt before that. In the United States, the Chicago School, you'll hear about the Chicago School of Law and Economics. They are those, George Mason is also a law school that is dedicated to a free market ideology, although I think theirs is more neoconservative than Chicago's is neoliberal. The scholars, Milton Friedman, Gary Becker, Richard Posner, Robert Coase, James Buchanan, all of these are lines of what's called law and economics. The idea, and so let me put law and economics in its best light. Why shouldn't the law maximize national GDP? And the argument becomes all of the diversity in America the conservative view of justice, religion, a Christian view of justice, Muslim view of justice, Black view of justice. All these views of what justice is, they vary so much. Even if we disagree vehemently about that stuff, don't we kind of agree that the country is better if it is wealthier than if it is not wealthier? That we kind of like a wealthy country rather than a poor country? That if that's the case, then perhaps judges should focus on making the country wealthy and letting the rest of us figure it out after that. Should law be at least concerned with the finance, even if you don't think that they should maximize it, even if you don't think that judges should solely focus on economics, there is still the argument, should law be at least concerned a little with the financial health and wealth of the country? And if you agree with that, let's continue, because that's what I do agree with that. And although critical race theory and law and economics seem to be opposed to each other, I am more pragmatic and try to find a way for them to fit within each other. Okay. How much time we got? All right, 15 minutes. You ready for econ without math? Let's try econ without math. And somebody mentioned about minimum wage, and we're going to invoke it here. All right, so simple free market. I'm sorry, first of all, who has had any economics majors in the building? Okay. Anybody had more than one economics class? Okay, a couple. So everyone had, who has not had any economics classes at all? All right, just trying to get a sense of where we're going to go. All right, so I'm going to assume, so first of all, what does economics mean? The efficient allocation of scarce resources, right? We don't have enough time, money, and energy to do everything we want to do. And so rare things, so rule one out of that statement comes, rare things tend to be more valuable than common things, right? And this is true, again, of financial stuff, of friendship, of family, of love, and all that other stuff. Rare things are more valuable than common things. From that rule, that's interesting. Rule number two, almost everyone tends to want to buy low and sell high, right? There are some people that don't care about money at all. There are some people, again, religious orders that disavow money entirely. And not only that, those of us that do like money, we don't operate our whole entire lives on it, but almost everyone tends to want to buy low. I want to spend less money. I want to spend less time. I want to spend less energy. So economics focuses on money, but we can talk about all resources that we're expending, right? And we want to sell and get the most out of those things. Very simple stuff, right? All right. So consumers, as a buyer, if things have a low price and I really like it, I want a lot of it, right? That's it. And if that has a high price, then I'm not gonna buy as much of it. The very same thing. So if a bottle of if Coca-Cola or some soda costs, if I really like it and it's on sale for 20 cents a bottle, I'll probably buy more of it. On the other hand, I like it, but they raised the price to $10 a bottle, I'm probably going to buy less of it. What if it's insulin? I don't have a choice, right? So we're not going to talk about elasticity of so-called demand curves, but the tendency is, generally speaking, consumers want more stuff at low prices, less stuff at high prices. Producers, if I'm the seller, I want the opposite, right? We're competing with each other. If I can get a high price for some good, then I'm going to try to get a lot of it and sell it. But if the price is not high, then I probably don't want to sell that. I want to probably sell something else that's going to make me more money, right? So we don't need numbers to appreciate that, right? That tends to be true, right? That people tend to operate that way. And we really need to say tend in economics so that we don't make this a rule, that people don't always do this. And even though people do it most of the time, no one does it all the time. So that is explaining what we call supply and demand, right? It's, I'm not even going to draw the curve for you, but you've seen that X, right? That so when people, the supply curve goes like this, the demand curve goes like that, and somewhere along they cross each other. That at a certain point, if soda costs $1, the price point for soda is at $1. I, as the soda company, will sell, I don't know, 1,000 units. On the other hand, the people that buy it, they also want 1,000 units. So I produce as much as they want and no more, right? There's no leftovers. That is what's called efficient. If it's $2, I might produce 2,000, but people only want to buy 500, and therefore there's 1,500 not sold. That's wasteful. Or if it's down to 50 cents, people may want to buy 2,000, but producers only want to put out 500. So 1,500 people are left out in the cold. That's thought to be inefficient. That's what we mean when we say things are efficient or inefficient, right? Okay. So my mentioned minimum wage. So before we talk about it in terms of racial and asymmetric market inspection, let's talk about it in terms of inefficiency. And know that my very first class in economics, the reason why I majored in economics is because the professor and I argued the entire class away on this one issue. The professor said that minimum wage is inefficient and that it shouldn't be. That there shouldn't be laws that promote inefficiency, and minimum wage is inefficient. Why did he say that? He says why? Because if you raise the price of minimum wage, then that means there are going to be less employers that can afford it, right? And then there will be less people working. To raise minimum wage, the argument is that there will be less jobs available. So, and let's take again, I am one that argues for progressive regulation. So if minimum wage would have been raised to $15 an hour, right? If that applies to black barbershops or mom and pop barbershops, restaurants, bookstores, it does have the effect that those folks may not be able to hire as many people as they would otherwise. Perhaps not. Now, on the other hand, that's balanced by what? The people that do keep their jobs are much better off. And then they may create businesses themselves that hire. So there is arguments on both sides. Before I get to you real quick, let me give the opposite one, because we don't talk about this one as much. What about a maximum wage? We talk about a minimum wage, but what about maximum wage? What if we had a law that said nobody gets paid more than $100,000, or no one gets paid more than $150,000, $150,000 a year, right? I know there's a lot of justice-minded people in the Zoom call, but I'm going to assume that maybe one or two of you think that maybe in your lifetimes you might earn a little more than that per year. That you might be worth more than that. And what happens if you can't? Do you work as much? Do you work as hard? So again, these are what's concerned. This is what's considered so-called inefficient. The idea that people will change their behavior based on the law, right? That they will change their, and so is civil rights law. Civil rights law, Title VII and all of them have been attacked as being inefficient because it changes private behavior. It will cause corporations to hire less than they ordinarily would, or make decisions that they ordinarily would not. Ms. Henson, you had a comment?
Well, this is just a question. It's been a while since I took economics, and it was mostly kind of social science leaning. But isn't it, or case needs dividend level?
Well,
Maybe misunderstood.
I'm Sorry, I didn't catch it was going in and out, so I didn't catch the question.
Oh, I said, doesn't Keynesian economics depend on the existence of us? Like it assumes that there's always going to be a certain amount of unemployment, certain percentage of unemployment.
Oh, yes. So as a matter of fact, so Keynesian and monetarism argues that there is that full employment is going to be something above zero. What that full employment means, or what is the appropriate number for full employment, that has been debated over the years. However, minimum wage and all that, it's that is usually in relation to the Federal Reserve. And I don't really want to go too far off track there. But yes, you are correct that we are in a monetarist economic society. So Keynesian economics has kind of been slapped up and thrown to the side. However, regardless of whether you're Keynesian or Milton Friedman monetarist, there is a concept of full employment that economists respect. It is most often invoked in terms of the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve Board raises and lowers the interest rates to affect employment. Right, that is supposed to be their number one goal. However, their target is never 0% employment. Right. So yes, good point. Okay, so the argument that you will be confronted with, for those that are interested in justice, for those that are interested in civil rights laws, to look out for the subordinated, is that conservatives will argue that those laws are inefficient, that they hurt our society, they make us less wealthy because they make businesses and people interact in ways that they would not otherwise. That if you left them alone, GDP will maximize, but if you interfere with them, each interference will drag it down a little. But here's the question, and here's where racially asymmetric market imperfections rears its head. What are their numbers based on, right? Economics is a hyper-empirical discipline, right? Everything is supposed to be based off numbers and statistics, right? But where are the basis for their assumptions and their that this price will go here, that price will go there, those numbers will, consumers will want this. They make very confident statements about human behavior. Where does that come from, this understanding about how humans act? When, Ms. Hinton, you mentioned economics, that's more psychology, right? When we're talking about this is the way humans work, this is what they will do, right? So economics has assumed itself over other disciplines. So, but where do those assumptions come from? There are 4 assumptions of a free market. So Gary Becker, Coase, all the people that I mentioned a second ago, their numbers on this is inefficient or that's that are dependent on 4 things being true. This is so important. These 4 things they believe are true, which are clearly are not. Number 1, everybody is a profit maximizer. Everybody, there is perfect competition. There is perfect information. There are no transaction costs at all. If those 4 things are true, then the numbers work. But what if those assumptions are true? Right? Let's talk about it. Perfect rationality, profit maximization. Everyone is a profit maximizer. Everyone is perfectly rational and always concerned about getting the most while spending the least. Now, even corporations, you could say this is true about corporations because their charters say that they have to maximize a shareholder value. And yet we know that even firms operate in stupid fashions, that people make up these institutions and can make dumb decisions. But regardless, Firms aren't the only people, corporations aren't the only people in the marketplace. People are. And people, for some people, first of all, some things are never for sale, right? Some people, I'm not selling my kids. Sorry, I don't care how much you offer them. Well, no, I'm not selling my kids, no matter how much you offer, right? On the other hand, and also some people are more altruistic than others. Some people give more to church, more to charity. So this idea that everyone is a profit maximizer, that everyone wants $10 instead of $5, that everyone will sell their child for the right price is not true, even though economic assumptions are based on that being true. 2, perfect competition. Everyone can enter or leave any market they choose. Right? If we're going to play this game with soda and how many consumers are going to buy and sell and blah, 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 well, then that means you have access to selling soda. That means you have access to buying soda. So perfect competition assumes that everybody can go into enter or leave any market they choose. But in real life, we know that you need financial capital to be in certain markets. You need political capital to be in certain markets. You need social capital. You need human capital. You need know-how to be in these markets. And slavery and all that told us that some markets you're not even allowed to leave, right? Perfect information. That's the one that's probably most obviously not true, right? There's no way humans in any capacity have perfect information. Right? It's the easiest part to debug. And then no transaction costs. What do we mean by transaction costs? Externalities, accidents, pollution, even crime. These are things that are attached to a transaction that is not reflected in the price. Yes, I paid to go to a baseball game, but that doesn't account for the fact that I could get hit upside with a baseball, or that there is people that die off of bad food preparation and what have you. And the interesting thing is, government is itself a transaction cost that economists do not account for. Number 2, government sets the price of other transaction costs. So even though you don't come up with a price between you and the car manufacturer about accidents, the government will force you to have insurance to account for the fact that cars have accidents. And not only that, if you run into someone, that's a free transaction if you get away with it. But no, the government will set the price. You ran over that person involuntarily, and therefore that transaction is going to cost you $300,000 or whatever the case may be. You could even look at crime similarly as the government and the people setting the price of a particular transaction, right? Can't do the crime, can't do the time, don't do the crime, right? That you pay for your actions. All right, so a free market assumes all of this. If we're saying that the market does this or the market is efficient, that's not what the market would do. They're assuming this perfect market that does not exist, right? Now, everybody knows it doesn't exist. I'm not saying anything new. I'm not saying anything that people, very intelligent people don't know. So the question becomes law's intervention. Law already intervenes. We just talked about tort, criminal law, environmental protection, dealing with transaction costs. We deal with fraud, laws against fraud, public school, government information production, reports, inspections. Those are all to bring about better information in the marketplace. We have antitrust laws, anti-monopoly laws. Those are designed to improve competition. We even, again, the protection of the individual, the protection of the child, or even about mental health and rationality. The government intervenes to shore up the imperfection in all of these. And so it is my argument that where these dynamics are race, and I'm rushing right now because we only have a couple minutes, so we might even be arguing that when these dynamics are racially asymmetric, that the government also has a responsibility, or is at least authorized to also intervene, and that we can include implicit biases microaggressions, hate crimes, affirmative action, school to prison pipeline, any racial dynamic you can think of, I can put into one of these categories as far as asymmetrical transaction costs, asymmetrical market information, asymmetrical competition, or asymmetrical rationality. I'm going to stop there, and we're going to put my theory to the test as we continue the discussion of implicit biases, affirmative action, and defining a racial realism theory next Wednesday. Thank you for bearing with me. Comments and questions as we go? All right. You can stick around if you have some. Otherwise, we'll see you guys on next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor.